Hi guys, so if you saw my review of the original Silent Hill just last week, you'll know that I gave it 5 out of 5. As far as I'm concerned, it's one of the most underrated horror films out there. And my memory of this second one was quite good, at least up until this week, but watching it this time, casting my more analytical eye over it, I had a much worse experience, sadly. So Silent Hill Revelation came out in 2012 and was directed by Michael Bassett. I'm just going to jump straight into the negatives today. I do have some good things to say about the film a little bit later on, but I want to start with the story. The story in this film is absolutely atrocious. If you've seen the first one and you've come to this one, you'll know that there just wasn't any story left to tell after the first movie. Okay, Sharon and Rose were still trapped in the other world, I guess, but we didn't need to know what happened to them. You could make your own mind up. You could take the positive approach to it and just presume that eventually they'll get out of there once the real world has had time to sort of adjust to their presence, maybe. Or you could take the more pessimistic view and believe that they're trapped in that place forever. But the point is, it's entirely up to you. We didn't need it confirming for us either way. It's a bit like the ending to The Thing with McCready and Childs in the snow. We didn't have to know if they were going to get rescued or not. We could just make our own decision. And the weird thing about Silent Hill Revelation being a direct sequel to the first film is that the video game series back in the day, they were always standalone games. You know, it was like the complete opposite to the Resident Evil video game series. The Resident Evil games were always one long continuous thing, a continuous mythology. Part of the fun of it was getting to explore more of the world, more of the characters from game to game. Silent Hill wasn't like that. It was always a completely different story each time, which just happened to involve this place of Silent Hill, whether you believe it to be a real place or just a figment of the character's imagination. Okay, in the third Silent Hill game, there were some callbacks to the first game with the reintroduction of Harry Mason as a side character, but the Silent Hill 3 game could still stand on its own thing. It was still its own beast. The Silent Hill 2 movie, aka Silent Hill Revelation, aka Silent Hill Revelation 3D, is absolutely not its own beast. It is a direct sequel to the first film. So how is it that Rose manages to get Sharon and herself out of the other world? Well, she only manages to get Sharon out, which tells me that what actually happened is that they couldn't get Radha Mitchell for this film, or they just couldn't afford both Sean Bean and Radha Mitchell, so they came up with this stupid storyline where only the daughter was able to come back, because apparently Rose picked up some kind of talisman called the Seal of Metatron at some point during her travels in Silent Hill. I don't remember this from the first film at all, but apparently she has this talisman which she can use to get people from one dimension to the other, but she can only use it on one person. Yeah, what complete and utter bullshit. I'm amazed that Sean Bean came back into this film, by the way. I'm sort of surprised that he was in the first film, because I know he did the Hitcher remake as well at some point in the noughties, but I still don't really think of him as a horror guy. So credit to him for doing the first one, but I don't know why he came back for this one. Did he not read the script? I did watch the audio commentary for this film the other night, or half of it. That was as much as I could stomach, and it was sort of revealed in that he wasn't keen on doing another Silent Hill film, but the director met up with him and somehow talked him round and said, no, it's going to be great, honest. And I think part of the reason why he ultimately did come back is because he was able to do all of his scenes in a week, but God knows what he thinks of the finished product of this. Another actor who is strangely in this film is Malcolm McDowell. This director, Michael Bassett, he must really have the gift of the gab, talking all these really high quality actors into being in a film like this. Malcolm McDowell in 2012 was surely riding the crest of the wave of his popularity from doing the Halloween films. He was Loomis. You'd think his star was on the rise somewhat, but no, because when he got the chance to be in this film, he took it, even though it would mean only being in one scene, and it's a really bad scene as well. I mean, sometimes good actors can be in just one scene in a movie, and it's a really amazing, memorable thing, such as Christopher Walken in True Romance. That is one of Walken's most memorable performances ever. And in fact, he was in one scene in just Pulp Fiction as well, and that was amazing too. But Malcolm McDowell's one scene in Silent Hill Revelation is just one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. So he's playing this character who is locked in a dungeon, and the older version of Sharon, because she's aged quite a few years for this second film, she stumbles into this guy quite late on in the film, and Malcolm McDowell, he grabs the talisman thing off Sharon. I think it might be half a talisman rather than a full talisman, and he pushes it inside himself or something. And this somehow re-energizes him, and he's able to then break his chains. He looks like Ebenezer's ghost in this scene. It's just ridiculous. And then he knocks out Sharon or something, puts her over his shoulder, walks off with her, probably to give her some really bad fate. But then Sharon comes to. She's still on his shoulder at this point, reaches down. There's like a hole in Malcolm McDowell's stomach from where he forced the talisman in. So she reaches inside his body, pulls the talisman back out. It's now become fully formed somehow since it was inside this body. And in pulling the talisman out, that completely ruins Malcolm McDowell's little plans. He somehow vaporizes into thin air or something. And meanwhile, Sharon can just carry on with her adventure with the talisman now fully formed, and this somehow is a good thing for her as she heads towards the finale. It's just absolutely and honestly ridiculous. Carrie-Ann Moss is in this film as well, in a role that's barely bigger than McDowell's. I just don't get it. I mean, this is a fairly well-known Hollywood actress who was in big things like The Matrix and Memento. Why she would agree to be in Silent Hill Revelation in a small part like this, it's beyond me. Unless one of her kids is into the Silent Hill games or something. So she plays Christabella's sister, Christabella being the evil religious nutjob who was the main villain of the first film. Yeah, of course Christabella has an evil sister we never previously knew about. And of course this evil sister has her own evil cult in a different part of Silent Hill that we never knew about. And of course this new cult is even bigger and more far-reaching than Christabella's cult from the original film. But I don't like this sister character. She's very one-dimensional. She's just nowhere near as well drawn as Christabella. It looks like she's got talcum powder on her face. She can turn into this weird creature with razor blades sticking out of its cheek. That's quite a cool look, but on the whole, this is just a very thinly done villain. I don't like what they've done with Pyramid Head in this movie as well. Personally, I would have not included Pyramid Head this time around. I would have just kept him as a cool thing from the first film, because if you go back to the games, he was only in Silent Hill 2, he wasn't in 1 and 3. Sometimes you can have too much of a good thing. And in this film, what they've done is they've turned him good at the end of it, a bit like Jaws in Moonraker. So he just turns up and starts fighting this creature with the razor blades, and that gives Sharon a chance to get away. I'm just not a fan of it. I'm not a fan of what they've done with the Douglas Cartland character, who was so prominent in the Silent Hill 3 video game. He's brought in here, but he's killed off very early. The whole plot is just so bad, and they've had to perform such ridiculous narrative gymnastics to get the whole thing moving. They've had to put in all this nonsense about talismans and things like that. I'm just not big on it at all. I've got a couple of ideas of what they could have done with a sequel. One of these ideas does involve Sharon and Rose, and the other is more of its own thing. So if you absolutely had to bring back Sharon and Rose, what I would have done is, well, for starters, I would have kept Radha Mitchell and not used Sean Bean. I don't know if that would have been possible. I don't know if Radha Mitchell would have wanted to do it. But let's say, theoretically, she was willing to be in the Silent Hill sequel. I would have had Rose and Sharon stuck in the alternate dimension, but then the hellscape starts to appear all around them, so it's followed them out of Silent Hill into the real world, because that actually happens in the Silent Hill 3 video game. In the first two games, the main characters have to go to Silent Hill themselves in order to experience these surroundings changing around them and becoming all hell-like, but they switched it up a bit in the third game and had the Heather character in that game just at the local mall, and suddenly hell was becoming all around, and I thought that was a neat little change, but it was only about halfway through Silent Hill 3, the game, that she did actually go to Silent Hill. But I would have incorporated that here into this Silent Hill movie sequel just to shake things up a little bit. I don't know how I would have taken the story forward after that, but that would have been my starting point. It would have been a lot less silly than the whole talisman thing. My other idea for a possible sequel would be a mostly standalone film. So there's a character who's actually in Silent Hill Revelation who Sharon meets after she gets to Silent Hill. It's this girl who's about her age who claims that she's ended up in Silent Hill because she was just on the road and she got lost in the fog, which is quite a curious thing. I think it's the only time this has happened completely randomly across the two movies. This character is killed off very quickly, but it led me to think, well, why not just do a sequel where a busload of people or something are just randomly going quite close to the town, get lost in the fog, and end up in Silent Hill? It would have been a different way to approach a Silent Hill movie. Later on in the script, you could have had a couple of callbacks here and there. You know, the characters could have stumbled across Radha Mitchell in a guest role or something like that. So there you go. One idea of a possible way to do a standalone, one idea of how to do a possible sequel, but the actual sequel that they've gone for here and the completely unnatural ways they've had to twist this plot, and what they've done with the Sharon character, what they've done with the Christopher character, leaving Rose in Silent Hill, it's really odd. Christopher in this film, he's decided not to go and look for Rose in Silent Hill. He's decided to stay and look after Sharon, but then at the end of the movie, because he finds himself in Silent Hill, he abandons his pledge to look after Sharon and just decides to go off and look for Rose, even though that is almost certainly going to lead to his death. It really doesn't make any sense. Now, I did say there were some positives, and once Sharon, or Heather if you like, finally gets to Silent Hill, the film does pick up for a good half an hour. There are some really exciting scenes. It's just really bizarre how long it takes us to get to that point. The first film was much more fluid and fluent at getting Rose to Silent Hill. That was a 2-hour movie, but she seemed to get there a lot quicker than Sharon does in this movie. This is a much shorter movie, but the amount of hoops that she has to jump through seemingly before she finally gets on the yellow brick road to Silent Hill, it does take some time. But like I said, there are some really good bits and pieces once we do get there. At one point she gets trapped in this mannequin factory thing. It might be the best scene in the movie, this. And there's this weird mannequin monster which is just made up of like prosthetic limbs and heads, and every time this thing kills somebody, it then turns them into a mannequin, takes the pieces it wants, adds them to its body. It's a really great creation and quite a chilling little scene, as short-lived as it is. There's also a good scene where Pyramid Head is walking down this corridor and just cutting off the arms of these prisoners who are just leaning out of their cells, like just begging to be rescued. And one more scene I'm going to mention, it involves the demon-like nurses. Now, I don't think when I did my review for the first film that I talked about the scene with the nurses that much. But as much as that scene was pretty good, where Rose went down into the basement of the hospital and she came across these nurses, they were set up in a very kind of regimented, uniform way. It was almost like a bunch of soldiers at an army parade. And I think in the second film, they're spaced out a lot better. It feels more random and natural. So there's these cult members who are basically pulling Sharon. Oh no, it's actually Kit Harington's character, I think. He's on this gurney strapped to it, and the cult members bring him into this room, and there's all these nurses spread about the place. And I just love how the cult members don't really take the threat of the nurses seriously. I think they know that they're there, but like I said, they're just really lapsadaisical about the threat. It sort of reminds me of that film, the original Dawn of the Dead, where Tom Savini's leather-clad bikers go into the mall, and they know the zombies are there, but they just don't think that they're that big a threat to them, and it proves their undoing in the end, because gradually they start to get surrounded and taken out one by one, and quite a few of them die, even though some of them do escape. But what we have here in Silent Hill Revelation in this scene is sort of like a smaller version of that. It's really cool when the nurses take these two guys out. So in the second half of the film, there are quite a few cool little scenes like this which do make the movie watchable. And if I go back to the first half with just a little bit extra to say as well, there are some really good flourishes and cool little visual moments. Heather hallucinates a lot, and we see some really good stuff when she's just hanging out in the mall. So there's this children's party, and she's looking at these kids, and then suddenly she's hallucinating that they're eating like zombie flesh, and she ends up getting on a bus to sort of leave this place, and there's this weird guy leering at her, and again, just a really nice touch. There's another moment where she has some kind of daydream about Dark Alessa walking through Silent Hill, and Dark Alessa's doing this and making all the leaves come off the ground, and people are running around in fear. So there's quite a lot of really interesting little creative touches in this film, boom, 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 one after the other. I could probably name about 15 or 20 of them. Whoever wrote this film had a lot of creative ideas about things that they could put on screen that would just look really cool, but it's just a shame that the story therein is so very bad. What's the phrase I'm looking for here? The sum of the parts is just not as good as the parts themselves, I guess is what I'm saying. So if I'm going to sum up, I don't think this film is unwatchable. Well, it probably is if you come to it and you're not a fan of the video games. I don't think watching the first movie and then coming to this is enough. I think if you're going to get any enjoyment out of Silent Hill Revelation, you've got to be a big fan of the overall franchise, games and films, because one of the biggest pleasures I get out of this particular one is just the visual style and how much it copies the Silent Hill 3 video game in particular. They put a lot of little Easter eggs in to do with the stuff from that game, like the giant bunnies and the fairground and birthday cakes and things like that, but you won't understand that if you've never played the games. So certainly I will possibly go back to this in the future if I'm watching the first film, but I just can't see anybody getting much pleasure out of this film unless you're an absolute diehard of the franchise. And even someone like me, I mean, I've never played all of the games, just some of them, and not for a long time now, and certainly judging this film compared to the original is a disappointing process to have to go through, because it is a hell of a come down, unfortunately. So let's get to the bag of terror and see what sort of score we've got for this. Just 2 bloody axes out of 5, and bear in mind I gave the first film 5 out of 5, so we've really gone downhill. And in all honesty, I think I've been quite generous in even giving this film 2. It's the fan in me coming out, I think. So there we have it. There's my review for Silent Hill Revelation. I'll be back with another review very, very soon. Until next time, cheerio.